Well, as we enjoy the summer months, Lake Erie heats up. And while that's good news for swimmers, it's bad news for possible algae blooms. Forecasters predict a significant harmful algae bloom for Western Ohio Lake this year, Lake Erie. Great Lakes Today reporter Elizabeth Miller attended the forecast announcement and brings us details. Hey Liz, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So you went out to Gibraltar Island for the forecast. Not a lot of folks get to go out there. Who else was there besides you?
Yeah, so the room yesterday at the forecast announcement was full of reporters, environmental advocates, and a lot of politicians. So Gibraltar Island is owned by Ohio State University that runs Ohio Sea Grant. And the lab is the island is a research laboratory, Stone Lab. So there were a lot of people there, and there was also a webinar later that day with hundreds of attendees. So I think that shows how important the issue of harmful algae blooms is to Ohioans.
Okay, let's get to the forecast then. What do we expect this year?
Well, it doesn't look very good,
oh, no.
But we've seen worse. Researchers say this year's algae bloom will be significant. So it might be the third or fourth worst on record. And that's because of all the rainfall we had this spring and the phosphorus loads that end up in Lake Erie. To put it another way, this year's algae bloom is a 7.5 on the severity index. And the range is from 1 to 10. But the range doesn't really mean much because in 2015 it was a 10.5. So it looks like it's going to be a big bloom, but this doesn't say anything about its toxicity. Researchers are trying to figure out how best to figure out that toxicity, but we're years away from predicting that.
Okay, so right now for the folks that swim, boat, fish, what's this mean for them?
Well, it means you want to stay out of the western Lake Erie Basin if you're swimming later on this summer. I spoke with Laura Johnson from the Heidelberg University Center for Water Quality Research about this topic, and she told me about some of the ways that harmful algae blooms can impact you. Here's what she had to say.
The simplest impacts is that it smells bad and it looks bad, right? Nobody wants to swim in green water. The other impacts, of course, are that the algae that are growing, and technically they're cyanobacteria, that are growing in the western Lake Erie Basin can produce a toxin, and this toxin is really toxic, right? You're like, oh, it's from an algae, it can't be that big a deal, but we're talking about something that's worse than cyanide. So, if it is scummy on top of the surface, then that stuff can be really bad for you to consume.
And Johnson says that it's actually really bad for pets to consume as well, so you want to keep Max out of the water there. And it's important to note that these harmful algae blooms are only affecting the western Lake Erie Basin. This says nothing about our Cleveland beaches here or even the eastern side of Lake Erie.
Okay, and you spoke as well with a Lake Erie charter boat captain.
Yes, and you think about all the people swimming or boating on the lake, but it's also important to think about the people who use the lake for their business.
Right.
So I talked to Dave Spangler. He's the vice president of the Lake Erie Charter Boat Association, and he's become a big voice for those who use the lake economically. He already has a plan for this year's algae bloom season. He was at the forecast with me yesterday, and his plan starts with satellite images from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Here's what he had to say.
What we need is those photographs and coming off the satellite, and now we can track it because it goes wherever the wind blows it to. So we can rearrange where we're going to go. So that's how we will do it right now, is we'll direct ourselves where we're going to take our people out to try to avoid it. If it gets towards the 2015 area, then we're going to have another bad year as far as financially. We're not going to take people out.
What's all this say about the efforts to reduce phosphorus flow into Lake Erie? We've been talking about it for years now.
I know, and I think it says we've still got a long ways to go. As you may know, the U.S. and Canada reached an agreement to reduce phosphorus by 40% by 2025. And so looking at some of the phosphorus loads that came into Lake Erie this year, those numbers are double what we need to see to get that 40% reduction. So it still looks like we're far off from there.
Yeah, it's got to upset the environmental groups that think we've been pushing harder.
Yeah, exactly. And they're upset because we see these algae bloom forecasts every year. And so they want regulation for farmers that might contribute to the runoff ending up in Lake Erie.
Hey, so the last thing is, when do we expect these blooms to begin? I know we're getting halfway through July now.
Yeah, so later on this month and early August is when we might expect to see the harmful algae blooms, and the best way to keep up with that is to look at the NOAA forecast. They do a twice weekly forecast for the bulletin.
And like you said, keep Max out of the water.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Elizabeth Miller, thanks so much.